What's up guys, welcome back to Core CSS Mastery. We're going to be talking about floats in CSS. Floats in CSS allow us to create some very simple layouts. And the most common use of float is when we have a body of text and we want that text to wrap an image which is either to the left or to the right of the text. Now the best way to illustrate this is just to see an example. We have three colored divs. So we have a background color of red, green, and blue respectively. And we can also see that we have this container class which styles all of the divs, and it just gives some width, height, font size, and a border to those divs. We also have a paragraph of text, and we've given the property font size and set the value to 25 pixels on the text, just so it's a bit larger. Now we'll make use of the float property, and the most common values are float right and float left. We can also remove the float with float none. Now keep in mind that when we set the float property on an element, it will generally affect the elements below that element on the page. So looking at our page right now, we have our blue div, and below that we have the paragraph. So when we set float left on the blue div, it's going to affect the paragraph. In fact, the paragraph is going to be moved up the page, and it's going to wrap around that blue div, which will now float to the left of the text. Let's see what that looks like. And we can also use float right. Now that div is going to appear to the right of the text. Just to see the effect in a bit more detail, let's boost this font size. And we'll see that although the text appears to the left of the div, once the height of the div has been exhausted, now the text reverts to taking the full width of the viewport. Now we're not limited to just one floating element. For example, if we move to the next element up, which is the green div, we can also set a float on the green div. So let's set float left. Now we can see we have one div to the left of the text, another div to the right of the text. What if we also set the green div to float right? We can see now that they stack. The green div is now floating to the right of both the paragraph and the floating blue div. And we could do the same as well with the red div. We can set float right, and that's now going to float to the right of absolutely everything. We could also set one div to the left and two to the right. For example, we could set float left on the red div. You can see that the red div appears to the left of the text and the blue and green divs appear to the right of the text. Now, one final property we need to be aware of is the clear property. Now, to illustrate how this works, let's make our paragraph slightly smaller, and let's copy and paste a new paragraph below the existing paragraph. Let's refresh the page. So what we can see is that float doesn't just affect the first paragraph. That wrapping effect is going to continue so long as the height of that red div has not been exhausted. But we might decide we don't want that second paragraph to wrap. We only want the float effect of that red div to apply to that first paragraph, then that second paragraph start to behave like a normal block. So we can use the property clear, and we can either clear the right float, the left float, or both of the floats. So let's put both in this case. This is just an inline style, so we don't have to select the element separately. And you can now see the wrap effect does not apply to that second paragraph. It starts to behave like a block element and starts beneath all of the existing elements on the page. Now that's about as far as most tutorials on CSS float go, but that's probably not doing the topic justice because there are a few headaches we can run into. So let's have a look at an example. Let's remove all of our floats. Let's reset the model essentially. So we'll be left with three divs with a set width and a paragraph. Now let's start by adding a float property to the red div at the top. Now if we use float right, we can probably predict what's going to happen. The green div is now going to appear at the top left, and the right div is going to appear at the far right of the page. Let's see if that's true or not. So we can now see that that right div is floating to the right of the left div. So what happens if we instead set float left on that red div? What would we expect to happen? Well, the most common answer is that we would now expect the red div to appear on the left and the green div to now appear on the far right. So we've just switched the sides of the two divs. Let's see if that's actually what happens. So we'll set a float left on the red div. So the green div, it appears to have completely disappeared at this stage. And we also have the numbers 2 and 3 overlaid against each other. So obviously this model is not behaving as we might expect when using the CSS property float. Now my viewpoint of float is that if you can figure out what's going wrong here, then you've essentially mastered CSS float. So I invite you at this stage to pause the video, try and reproduce this model, take some time to figure out why we're not seeing the red div appear in the top left and the green div appear in the top right. Don't worry too much if you can't figure it out, but the process of experimentation on this model is what's going to help you to get really good at using CSS floats. Okay, so let's start by explaining in a bit more detail how float actually works. So let's reset our model. And we're going to start by drawing a border around that red element. And rather than draw it around the red div itself, we'll actually add this in a container. Let's create a new div. Let's give it a class of wrapper. Let's end that wrapper the other side of the red div. Let's add some very basic styling on here. We're going to set a border so we can see the outline of this div. So let's set border solid, set it to 5 pixels so it's nice and thick. Let's have a look at that border. Now, of course, since a div is a block level element, we can see it's taking up the full width of the viewport, whereas the red div itself has a width of 100 pixels. Now let's see what happens if we set float right on that red div. Now we know this works. The green div will move up to the top left. We've tried this already. I've refreshed the page, but can you see what's happened to that border? That border has completely collapsed. In other words, that wrapper container now has a height of 0. And that's because when we set a float property on an element, so the red div in this case, that element is removed from the normal flow of the page. We can think of it as appearing in another dimension. And in that other dimension, that red div still has height, but with respect to our normal viewport, the normal dimension, the page is now treating that red div like it doesn't have any height. Therefore, its wrapper container now collapses to a height of 0 pixels because its content doesn't have any height. So now looking at that green div, well, obviously the way that a block level element works is it just occupies the next available piece of vertical space on the page. Well, that's just below our wrapper with the collapsed height. So we can get a feel for how float's actually working. It's making the element as if it has 0 height, which causes the block level element below it to occupy that existing vertical space. So with that in mind, let's revert to our slightly broken model and set float to left. What's happening here? Well, now we can actually see our green div, and it's directly under our red div. But hold on, wasn't that green element supposed to wrap to the right of the red div because the red div has a float of left? Well, the answer is it depends what type of display property is on the element. Right now we're dealing with block level elements, and we know with block level elements that they always look to take up the full width of the viewport. So we essentially have 2 block level elements competing for the same row. Part of the problem here is that both of those divs have the same width of 100 pixels. The only reason why it looks like the red div is slightly offset is because we set that fairly thick 5 pixel border on the wrapper container. So now we know what's happening. Let's remove the wrapper. So let's get rid of that border. We can't see the green element anymore, but we know where it is. It's directly beneath that red div. And let's set the width on the green div to twice the width of the red div. Let's set that to 200 pixels. Now what we have is what appears to be 2 divs side by side, both taking up 100 pixels. But what's happening is that green div is actually taking up 200 pixels, 100 pixels visible, and a further 100 pixels underneath that red div. Now the interesting thing here is that must mean that that number 2, the text, is automatically beginning at the edge of the red div. Now why is that? It's because text is not block level. It's considered an inline element. So it will automatically wrap that floating element. Now we can demonstrate this. Let's give the paragraph a background color of green. And let's slightly change the order of the document here. Let's copy this paragraph. In fact, we're going to cut it and we're going to paste it after the red container. Let's save, let's refresh the page. Now when we look at that paragraph, what it looks like is happening is not what's actually happening. Let me start by explaining what it looks like. It looks like we have a red div and then next to it, we have a green paragraph. That's not exactly what we have though. And we can demonstrate that by just adding a small amount of margin on that red div. So let's set a margin left of 25 pixels. That's going to shift over that red div slightly. And notice what's beneath that red div on the left. So what we see here is it's not the block level element that's floating, i.e. the paragraph. That block level element is still taking up the full width of the viewport. The thing that is floating to the right of that red div is just the text itself. And you can see that confirmed if you look at div 2, the green div. That 2 is still floating to the right of the red div. But the actual div itself, the block element, is still reserving the full width of the viewport and starting at the far left of the viewport. So now if you understand what's going on here, well now you understand CSS float. Let's just take this concept slightly further by playing around with the display type of those divs. I'm just going to quickly reset the model. Now remember our initial problem was we couldn't get this red div to float to the left of the green div. We now know the reason why, and we saw that we could technically solve that problem by setting a width on the green div, which is twice the width of the red div. But this is actually just an illusion. That green div is actually twice the width of the red div. We just don't see half of the green div. The reason they're behaving like this is because they are block level elements. They're always trying to take up the full width of the viewport. So what happens if we change the type of elements that they are? So let's set them to inline block. What this means is they are going to retain their width and height, but they're also going to start behaving like an inline element, for example, like text. And we saw that text was automatically wrapping because it's an inline element. Let's see what happens. Well, now we see the red div is floating to the left of the green div. And just to make this very clear, we can actually give the blue div a display of block, because at the moment these are all classified with that container class. So they are all inline block elements. But let's set the blue container to being a regular div. The blue div now jumps to a new line because it's now a block level element. But more importantly, the green div now respects the width of the red div because the green div has a display of inline block. So just to give you a quick way of thinking about this, that red div is essentially in a different dimension. Block level elements can't see the width of that red div. However, elements which are either inline or inline block can see the width of that red div, despite the fact that that red div is in a separate dimension. And that's what allows inline and inline block elements to wrap around that red div, whereas block elements can't see the red div's width and hence try and compete for space on that same row. So just to demonstrate that we have complete control over this, let's set float right on every element. Starting with the first element, which is red, which has been given the number 1. You see that is now floating to the right of the green and blue elements. The green and blue elements are appearing next to each other because they have a display of inline block currently. We removed the display of block from the blue div. So if we take our second element, the green div, we'll give that a float of right. You can see that now floats right, but not as far right as div number 1, the red div. And you can probably guess what happens if we set float right on the blue element. Well, not only does it now appear to the far right, but the element beneath that is the block level paragraph, and that's able to wrap to the left of those divs which are floating to the right. And we might think for a second, hold on a minute, how is the block level paragraph able to see the width of those colored divs? Well, the answer is it can't. That paragraph takes up the full width of the viewport. It's the text the inline text inside that paragraph, which is able to see the width of those colored divs and wrap around it. One final thing to try here is let's remove the width entirely of those elements. Let's just get rid of the float properties temporarily. So what we should expect to see now is those divs will take up the full width of the viewport if we also remove inline block. So currently they're still inline block, which means they're only going to take up the width of the text. Let's get rid of the display property there. So now they'll appear on separate lines, but they'll also take up the full width of the viewport by default. So what happens now if we float left was that first div? Well, we see that that red div is now taking up its minimum width based on the width of the text inside the box. And then the green div is taking up the rest of the width of the viewport. The reason why we can see both in this case is because we don't have that situation where the green div is exactly the same width as the red div and also just so happens to be directly underneath it. And just to show you that the size of that red div is going to expand based on the content, we'll just add a bit of extra text there. And you can now see that that red div still floating to the left, but it takes up more space because the width is determined by that content. Once again, you'll see that that green div is technically the full width of the viewport, and it's just an illusion that it only takes up 60% of the viewport or so. Once again, we can demonstrate that by adding a margin left of 25 pixels to the red div, and you can see the left-hand side of that green div, and we can see it's actually taking up the full width of the viewport. So yes, on level 1, CSS floats is mostly just about wrapping text around an image. But now if you are doing something even slightly more complicated, you'll be able to avoid a lot of the headaches that CSS developers run into when making use of CSS float. All right, thanks very much for watching, guys. Hopefully you're now experts with CSS float. Catch you in the next part of the course.